Imagine a car so stunning that even standing still it looked like it was in motion. A machine born from pure Italian artistry and restrained by scarcity. The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 was that rare creation. With only 500 coupes and a handful of spiders built, it was a fleeting glimpse of what happens when a brand famous for passion decides to remind the world of its identity through design and performance. The 8C Competizione wasn't just a sports car. It was a sculpture that carried the weight of Alfa's history, the desperation of revival, and the eternal question of whether beauty alone could elevate a machine into legend. This car made enthusiasts debate whether it was a driver's tool, an investment, or simply rolling artwork meant to stir the heart, and that debate is exactly why it still captivates today. To understand its power, you don't start with horsepower figures or lap times. You start with how people reacted when they first saw it unveiled. Hushed silence, a collective pause followed by thunderous applause. That is the kind of emotional resonance most cars can never buy. And yet, for all its allure, it raised one of the most fascinating dilemmas in modern automotive culture. When a car is this rare, this expensive and this iconic, does owning it diminish the dream? Or does the dream live precisely because so few could? We're about to dive into that paradox, exploring the backstory, the mechanics, and the cultural waves set off by Alfa Romeo's 8C Competizione. If you're enjoying this journey already, give this video a like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments what dream machine you'd like us to cover next. The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 didn't arrive in a vacuum. It came at a moment when Alfa was struggling to remind the world why its badge still mattered. The brand had a century of history behind it, but in the US especially, Alfa was almost a forgotten name. When the 8C broke cover, it wasn't pitched as a volume model, it was a statement of intent. Alfa wanted the world to remember that its DNA was not about selling sedans or competing in crowded markets. It was about romance, motorsport, and craftsmanship. This was the car meant to reclaim that heritage and broadcast it loudly. What makes the 8C's story compelling is that it fused a deeply nostalgic idea of Italian beauty with very modern mechanical underpinnings, creating a car that sat uneasily between categories. Was it a supercar? Was it a grand tourer? Or was it something else entirely? That's the tension that defined its identity, and to see how that tension was built, we need to trace both the motivations inside Alfa and the reception outside it. Microstory, the design that stopped Geneva. When the 8C Competizione concept first appeared at the Geneva Motor Show in 2003, it was like Alfa had dropped a bomb in the middle of an industry obsessed with function and aggression. Other manufacturers were busy chasing lap times and angular, futuristic styling. But here was a coupe that looked like a classical sculpture. Long hood, short deck, muscular haunches, the proportions recalled Alfa's great racing Berlinettas of the 1930s and 40s. Attendees didn't see a car. They saw a love letter to form. And though the concept wasn't promised for production at the time, the demand was immediate. People begged Alfa to build it. That moment set the tone for everything that followed. Because when public opinion is that unified, a manufacturer has little choice but to listen. Context Digest, why Alfa needed this halo. By the early 2000s, Alfa was not competing in the top echelon of performance cars. It had front-wheel drive sedans and hatchbacks, charming but hardly aspirational. In Europe, enthusiasts still loved the name, but globally, especially in America, Alfa had faded from view. A halo car is a marketing tactic. Build something so stunning and exclusive that it lifts the entire brand image. For Alfa, the 8C was the spearhead, designed less to make money and more to make noise. Every brand knew that the exotic car market was crowded, but Alfa had one thing others didn't: a legendary past rooted in design and racing victories. The 8C was a chance to leverage that past. Microstory, Ferrari and Maserati under the skin. Behind its romantic exterior, the 8C Competizione had bones that ensured it wasn't just a pretty face. Alfa was under the same corporate umbrella as Ferrari and Maserati, and it borrowed heavily from them. The chassis came from Maserati, ensuring balance and rigidity, while the engine was a 4.7-liter V8 with Ferrari influence, tuned for 450 horsepower. Purists debated whether this borrowing diluted Alfa's authenticity, but in truth, it made the 8C feasible. Without access to those resources, Alfa couldn't have built a car that met modern standards of performance. What mattered was how Alfa dressed those parts and infused them with its soul. and with the 8C, soul radiated from every curve. Reflection Bridge, the 8C Competizione wasn't just borrowing heritage, it was borrowing credibility. That credibility mattered, because Alfa was about to ask buyers to pay supercar money for something from a brand many had written off. Micro story. The exclusivity play. Alfa announced production would be capped at 500 units worldwide, instantly making the 8C Competizione a collector's piece. This wasn't mass market engineering. It was haute couture. For buyers, knowing that only a few hundred people on Earth could share the experience amplified the allure. But exclusivity cuts both ways. It meant few would ever actually drive one, and scarcity can turn a living machine into a static asset. Still, when orders opened, the car sold out almost instantly, with buyers clamoring despite little detail on performance figures. The styling alone had already done the heavy lifting. Context digest: why design trumped performance? By 2007, the supercar landscape was defined by top speeds, Nürburgring lap times, and outrageous horsepower. Yet Alfa didn't chase those numbers. The 8C wasn't the fastest, nor was it the most advanced. What it offered was an emotional experience, one rooted in how it looked, how it sounded, and how it made you feel behind the wheel. This was a deliberate counterpoint to the numbers game. Alfa was betting there was still a market for passion over stats. That gamble was risky, but it paid off in cultural impact. People who would never drive an 8C still remembered it, because beauty has a way of etching itself into memory. Reflection Bridge. The 8C Competizione thus set itself apart. It wasn't chasing the established supercar hierarchy. It was creating its own lane where emotion was the measure of success. Micro story. Reception in America. For US audiences, the 8C carried a special charge. Alfa had pulled out of the American market in the mid-90s, leaving enthusiasts nostalgic for the Spider and GTV days. When word came that a few 8Cs would be allocated to the States, it sparked a frenzy. Dealers were overwhelmed with interest, and collectors lined up for the chance to reconnect with a brand absent for over a decade. Though only a tiny fraction of cars made it here, their presence acted like a teaser trailer for Alfa's eventual return. It was less about the number of units and more about the symbolism. Alfa was back. And it was back with flair. Context digest: how scarcity shaped value. Limiting production to 500 units was both a marketing tactic and a practical necessity. Alfa couldn't afford to build more, and the complexity of the car meant margins were slim. But that scarcity had a long-term consequence. Values skyrocketed. Unlike many modern exotics that depreciate before rebounding, the 8C was valuable from day one. Collectors understood its role as a historical marker for Alfa, and demand always outstripped supply. Today, seeing one on the road is almost mythical, because most are stored away, appreciated more as investments than as vehicles. Microstory, the interior experience. Step inside the 8C Competizione, and the philosophy of blending art with machinery continued. Carbon fiber was exposed and sculpted into elegant forms. Leather was stitched with care that rivaled high fashion. The seating position was low and enveloping, the kind of cabin that immediately told you this was a driver's space. But it wasn't minimalist. It had a sense of drama, of occasion. This wasn't an appliance. It was an event every time you sat down. Owners often described it less in terms of ergonomics and more in terms of how it made them feel like participants in a piece of rolling theater. By now, the Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 had established itself not just as a rare commodity, but as a cultural statement in motion. Yet that set the stage for an even more complex question. What happens when a car that is celebrated for its beauty is also critiqued for its substance? The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 entered its middle chapter, not as an object of universal praise, but as a lightning rod for debate among enthusiasts and critics alike. Yes, it was undeniably beautiful, but beauty invites scrutiny. Could the 8C stand tall against rivals when it came to driving feel, performance metrics, and technological advancement? This was the tension that fueled conversations long after the applause of the Geneva unveiling had faded. The car's allure was unshakable, but when enthusiasts got behind the wheel, they discovered nuances that challenged the legend, making the 8C one of the most fascinating case studies in how emotion and engineering intersect. Microstory, the driving character. On paper, The 8C Competizione's Ferrari-derived 4.7-liter V8 promised 450 horsepower and a top speed near 180 miles per hour. In practice, it was a car that sang more than it sprinted. The exhaust note was operatic, rich with crackles and wails that made every throttle input a sensory event. But when pushed hard, critics noted understeer at the limits and a chassis that felt less precise than purpose-built supercars of the era. For some, that was a flaw. For others, it was irrelevant. The 8C wasn't meant to chase tenths of a second. It was meant to make you feel alive. That gap between expectation and reality became the heart of its polarizing reputation. Context Digest, the numbers game it avoided. In the late 2000s, performance cars were defined by their ability to dominate Nürburgring leaderboards. Brands competed ruthlessly to shave seconds, boasting of lap records like Olympic athletes. The 8C Competizione didn't participate in this arms race. Its lap times weren't headline-grabbing, and its technology, an automated manual gearbox, conventional suspension, already felt dated compared to dual-clutch rivals. But in sidestepping that numbers obsession, Alfa signaled it wasn't building a stopwatch car. It was building a soul car. That decision alienated some reviewers, but endeared it to collectors who saw beyond the spec sheet. Micro Story, the emotional defenders. For every critic calling the 8C compromised, there were owners and enthusiasts who defended it with passion. They argued that not every car should be judged on performance curves. The joy of the 8C, they said, came from how it looked parked in a driveway, how it echoed through a tunnel, how it drew a crowd at every gas station. It was a reminder that cars could still be art, not just science. This divide revealed a deeper cultural question. Are cars tools to be measured or experiences to be savored? The 8C dared to choose the latter, and that made it controversial. Reflection Bridge. The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione forced people to admit that cars could still be irrational, and in doing so, it highlighted the split between those who value data and those who value dreams. Microstory, the Spider variation. In 2008, Alfa unveiled the 8C Spider, a convertible version that doubled down on theater. Only 500 were built, matching the coupe's scarcity, and while the open top reduced rigidity, it amplified the sensory drama. With the roof down, that V8 soundtrack was unfiltered, bouncing off walls and mountainsides in ways that made the car unforgettable. The Spider wasn't meant to fix the 8C's critiques, it was meant to intensify what made it special. Buyers treated it as even more collectible, and in today's market, the Spider often commands higher values than the coupe because of that visceral edge. Context Digest. Why collectors didn't care about flaws. Collectors tend to prize rarity, story and design over outright performance. The 8C Competizione ticked all three boxes. It was a car you could park next to any exotic and it would steal attention. It carried the story of Alfa's rebirth attempt and the symbolism of limited production. In the collector's equation, its flaws became almost irrelevant. In fact, those imperfections made it more human, more authentically Alfa. To own one wasn't to seek perfection. It was to own a rolling contradiction that celebrated passion above all else. Micro Story, public memory versus private reality. While journalists dissected the car's dynamics, the public remembered something else. Posters, magazine covers, and YouTube clips cemented the 8C as a dream machine. Very few people ever drove it, but millions admired it from afar. In that sense, the car's cultural footprint was disproportionately large compared to its production run. It lived in the imagination of enthusiasts as much as it lived in garages, showing that sometimes perception is more powerful than reality. The irony is that this made the 8C almost critic-proof. No amount of nitpicking could erase the fact that people adored how it looked and sounded. Reflection Bridge, the duality of the Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione, was now clear. As a driving tool, it was imperfect, but as a cultural icon, it was flawless. Micro Story, the return to America. Alfa used the 8C's presence in the US as a stepping stone for its larger comeback strategy. By reintroducing the brand with a halo car, Alfa primed the market for the more accessible models that would follow. American enthusiasts who missed out on the 8C suddenly had a reason to pay attention when Alfa introduced sedans and coupes in the years after. Though those later models never matched the 8C's mystique, they benefited from the halo glow. In that way, the 8C wasn't just a one-off showpiece, it was a bridge for Alfa's re-entry into a major market. Context Digest. The economics of scarcity. Building just 500 coupes and 500 spiders wasn't only about image. Low production numbers also helped Alfa manage financial risk. Crafting a carbon fiber body and hand-assembling each car required massive resources. By limiting the run, Alfa could create an aura of exclusivity while keeping costs predictable. That strategy mirrored tactics of luxury fashion houses, limited edition runs that drive demand precisely because supply is choked. For Alfa, this wasn't just about building a car. It was about building a narrative of desirability. Microstory, owners as curators. Most 8C Competizione owners didn't daily drive their cars. They treated them like art pieces, rolling them out for shows, concours events, or spirited Sunday drives. That behavior reinforced the car's identity as a collector's darling rather than a utility machine. Each sighting became an event, a story for bystanders to tell. And in that sense, owners weren't just drivers. They were curators of Alfa's most precious modern artifact. That relationship between owner and machine is what has kept the 8C alive in cultural conversation long after production ended. By the time the Alfa Romeo 8C, Competizione of 2007 cemented itself in both criticism and cult status. The question shifted. What would its legacy be? And could one model genuinely reshape how an entire brand was remembered? The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 carried a burden far larger than its production numbers might suggest. It was asked to be both a brand savior and an eternal icon. By the time the last car left the factory, the debates about its performance and purpose had given way to something more enduring. The recognition that the 8C had already transcended ordinary categorization. It wasn't a car you evaluated like a rival supercar. It was a car you remembered, a car that defined a moment in automotive culture. In the years since, its reputation has only grown, showing how legacy can be shaped as much by story as by spec sheet. Microstory, influence on future design. Alfa designers mined the 8C Competizione's DNA for years afterward. The flowing lines, the V-shaped grille, the muscular stance, all reappeared in later models like the 4C and Giulia. Though those cars targeted very different audiences, they carried the 8C's aesthetic torch, reminding buyers that Alfa could still build machines that stirred the heart. The 8C thus became not just a halo car, but a blueprint, ensuring that even mainstream Alfa models looked like they belonged to a brand steeped in romance and artistry. Context digest: why scarcity fuels mythology. With only 500 coupes and 500 spiders ever produced, the 8C Competizione was rare from day one. As years passed, sightings became even rarer, pushing the car into mythical territory. Collectors whispered about auction results climbing into seven-figure ranges, and enthusiasts shared photos online like trophies. The less visible the 8C became in real life, the more powerful it became in the imagination. Scarcity didn't diminish its influence. It magnified it. This is how mythology works. Absence creates longing, and longing creates legend. Microstory, cultural placement beyond cars. The 8C Competizione also reached beyond automotive circles, appearing in video games, design museums, and fashion spreads. Its curves were studied like those of a sculpture, often described in the same breath as Italian high fashion. This cross-cultural presence ensured that even people with little interest in cars recognized the 8C as something extraordinary. In that way, it elevated Alfa Romeo from being just another car maker to being part of the global conversation about beauty and craftsmanship. Few modern cars manage that leap, but the 8C did it effortlessly. Reflection bridge: the Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione had become more than a product. It had become a cultural ambassador, representing not just what Alfa was, but what Italian design could mean to the world. Microstory, ownership reality years later. For those who bought one new, the experience was unlike owning any other car. Values appreciated almost immediately, meaning few felt the sting of depreciation. Service and parts could be complex, but owners often overlooked those headaches because they knew they held something irreplaceable. Stories abound of 8Cs being trailered to shows, polished obsessively, and treated more like heirlooms than vehicles. And for the rare owner who dared to drive it often, the experience was always described in emotional terms. Not technical ones, how it made them feel, how people reacted, how it turned every trip into an event. Context digest, market positioning now. In today's collector car market, the 8C sits in a unique niche. It's not as technologically advanced as some contemporaries, nor as fast, but it commands values on par with much more powerful exotics. Why? Because collectors understand that design-led icons are timeless. Performance figures can be surpassed every year, but beauty and scarcity remain fixed. The 8C is a case study in how to build lasting value not by chasing numbers, but by crafting identity, micro-story, the legacy in hindsight. Looking back, Alfa achieved exactly what it set out to do. The 8C Competizione reignited global awareness of the brand, paved the way for Alfa's US return, and carved a place in history for itself. Today, when enthusiasts discuss the most beautiful cars of the 21st century, the 8C is always on the shortlist. Its legacy is secure not because it was flawless, but because it dared to prioritize feeling over function, beauty over bragging rights. That choice, once controversial, now feels visionary. By the time the Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 settled into legend, it had proven that a single model, built in small numbers but rich with passion, could redefine a brand's image and remind the world that cars are more than machines. They're mirrors of our desires, our nostalgia, and our capacity to dream. The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione of 2007 leaves us with a lesson that resonates far beyond its 500 coupes and 500 spiders. At first glance, it seemed like a niche exercise in nostalgia, a chance for Alfa Romeo to remind the world it still had soul. But as we've traced its journey, it's clear the 8C did far more than that. It became a turning point, both for the brand and for the way enthusiasts view beauty in cars. In an era dominated by numbers, the 8C Competizione insisted that feelings mattered, that design could be destiny, and that scarcity could create a legend even without headline-grabbing specs. For US viewers, this story hits close to home, because the 8C was the car that marked Alfa's tentative return after a long absence. Even if only a handful landed here, those few cars acted like beacons, telling American enthusiasts that the romance of Alfa wasn't dead, it was alive, and it looked better than ever. Collectors recognized this instantly, and their willingness to pay and protect these cars kept values high. But ownership of an 8C wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. To hold the keys was to become a custodian of one of the most significant modern Italian designs, a role as much about preservation as about driving. And for the vast majority who would never see one up close, the 8C still offered something valuable. Proof that even in a world chasing efficiency and precision, there was room for art, for imperfection, and for heart. That's why the 8C Competizione matters. It didn't just sell out, it sold the idea that cars can be dreams first and machines second. So the next time you see a photo of one, or if you're incredibly lucky, catch sight of one on the road, remember this. The Alfa Romeo 8C Competizione wasn't built to dominate charts. It was built to dominate memory. And in that mission, it succeeded completely.